August 1945. The war was over, but the muddy jungle roads of Luzon were still choked with fear. Packed inside a U.S. Army truck, a dozen Japanese nurses huddled together, thin and exhausted. They'd spent years hearing that Americans were monsters, cruel beasts who would torture their prisoners. The truck stopped, but instead of cages, they were led into clean wooden barracks. Inside were rows of cots, with real mattresses and thick wool blankets folded neatly at the foot of each bed. One woman stared, her voice a fragile whisper. "This is a prison camp?" They had prepared themselves for brutality, but they never expected a kindness so disarming. It threatened to break them completely. If you believe that kindness can be more powerful than war, subscribe for more incredible stories you were never told in school. And I'd love to know, what part of the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The gears of the U.S. Army truck groaned as it churned through the mud of Luzon. It was August 1945, a month when the world was supposed to be breathing a collective sigh of relief. But here, the air was thick with the steam of the jungle and the stale scent of fear. Inside the truck's covered bed, Lieutenant Hannah Kondo sat ramrod straight, her nurse's uniform patched but clean, her hands folded primly in her lap. Around her, 11 other Japanese nurses swayed with the vehicle's lurching rhythm, their faces pale masks of exhaustion. For weeks, they had lived on rumors, whispers that passed between them in the dark like forbidden currency. The youngest, a bright-eyed girl named Michiko, leaned close to Hannah, her voice barely a tremor. "They say the Americans make lampshades from our skin." Hannah did not reply. She had heard worse. She had trained herself to expect worse. To be a soldier for the Emperor was to accept that your body was merely a tool, to be used and discarded. But captivity was a state she had never been trained for. It was a dishonor she could not yet comprehend. Death was clean. This was not. From the driver's cab, Sergeant Frank Dwyer glanced in his rearview mirror, catching a fleeting glimpse of the women's shrouded forms. Just a few months ago, on the bloody shores of Leyte, he had watched his younger brother bleed out in his arms. He had held his hand and cursed the very existence of the people now sitting in the back of his truck. They were the enemy, the reason for the empty chair at his family's dinner table back in Iowa. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, and focused on the muddy track ahead. His job was to transport them to the new POW compound, a place someone in command had ironically named Camp Harmony, another soft name for a hard place. He was a medic. He was supposed to heal, but his own heart was a wound that refused to close. The convoy finally rolled to a stop before a gate flanked by neat white signs. The canvas flap was thrown back, and a firm but not unkind voice ordered the women out. They blinked in the sudden, harsh sunlight, expecting to see barbed wire cages and guard towers manned by snarling men. Instead, they saw rows of simple, clean wooden barracks, the scent of fresh-cut pine hanging in the air. A tall American woman in a crisply pressed officer's uniform approached them. This was Captain Eleanor Reeves, the camp's supervising nurse. Her face was lined with a quiet sort of weariness, but her eyes held a steady, unnerving calm. She spoke in clear, slow English, and one of the women who understood a little translated. They were being taken to their quarters. Hannah braced herself, her mind picturing a concrete floor, a single drain in the corner. She followed Eleanor into one of the long buildings and stopped dead. The room was filled with light from open windows. Lined up in perfect rows were simple cots, but on each cot lay a mattress and, folded at the foot, a thick, grey wool blanket. A collective, involuntary gasp went through the small group of women. One of them touched a mattress, as if testing a mirage. Hannah stared, her disciplined mind struggling to process the scene. She had spent the last year sleeping on a thin straw mat in humid, rat-infested field tents. The memory of comfort was so distant it felt like a dream. Michiko, her eyes wide with disbelief, whispered the question that hung in the air like a ghost. "This is a prison camp." Unloading medical crates from his truck, Frank saw the look on their faces, the raw shock. He saw Hannah Kondo freeze at the sight of a warm bed. He turned to another soldier and muttered, a bitter edge to his voice, "Guess they expected worse." He didn't know if it was kindness or some new, elaborate form of cruelty. That night, sleep did not come easily. The mattress felt too soft, the silence of the camp too loud. Hannah finally drifted off, only to be thrown back into the inferno. The scream of artillery, the smell of blood and smoke, the faces of the dying boys she could not save. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding against her ribs, the nightmare clinging to her like a shroud. The barracks were dark and still. But then, she heard it. A soft, low sound from across the room. A humming. It was a simple melody, a gentle lullaby that rose and fell with a steady, peaceful cadence. Hannah sat up slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dark. She saw the silhouette of Captain Reeves moving between the cots, a damp cloth in her hand, tending to a prisoner who had fallen ill with a fever. The American nurse was humming a hymn, her voice a thread of grace in the suffocating darkness. Hannah couldn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, soft, patient, unwavering. It was the sound of a person mending what was broken. Without knowing why, Hannah lay back down, buried her face in the strange-smelling pillow, and wept. The tears were silent, hot, and cleansing. The next morning, the world felt different. As the women were being shown the mess hall, Hannah saw Captain Reeves organizing medical supplies. She walked over, her steps measured, her back straight. For a moment, she stood silently, gathering the few English words she knew. Eleanor looked up, her expression patient. "Thank you," Hannah said, the words feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. It wasn't just for the care the night before. It was for something bigger, something she couldn't name. Eleanor simply nodded, a faint, understanding smile touching her lips. A fragile bridge, made of a simple song and two simple words, had just been built over a chasm of hatred and war. The other women watched, their minds racing. Everything they had been taught, every piece of propaganda that had painted Americans as devils, was now being called into question. But could this kindness be trusted? Or was it merely a more sophisticated form of deception? Later that day, back in the barracks, Hannah picked up her wool blanket. She ran her hand over the coarse fabric, then slowly, meticulously, folded it into a perfect square. As she placed it at the foot of her cot, she brought it close to her face for just a second, inhaling its scent of clean wool and pine. She whispered to herself, so quietly no one else could hear, "It smells like home." In the weeks that followed, Camp Harmony began to live up to its name, not by any official decree, but through a series of small, quiet rebellions against the memory of war. The change began in fragments. It was Frank Dwyer showing a shy nurse how to make instant coffee, her surprised giggle echoing in the mess hall as she tasted the bitter, unfamiliar warmth. He pointed to his own chest and said slowly, "Thank you," then pointed to her. She mimicked the words, a fragile smile on her face. The phrase became a currency, traded for a piece of fruit or a clean bandage, each exchange chipping away another piece of the wall between them. One afternoon, a distraught Filipino woman appeared at the camp gate, cradling a feverish child. The American medics were swamped. Without a word, Hannah Kondo stepped forward. With a calm efficiency that silenced the guards, she assessed the child, cooling his brow and administering a dose of medicine she recognized from the American supplies. Frank and Eleanor watched from a distance as Hannah's gentle, skilled hands brought a crisis to a quiet close. She wasn't an enemy nurse then, she was just a nurse. Eleanor, too, waged her own quiet campaign. During a routine check of the barracks, she found a sketchbook hidden beneath a mattress. It belonged to Michiko. The pages were filled with delicate pencil drawings of faces, the young soldiers she and Hannah had tended, now ghosts on paper. It was a secret memorial, a catalogue of loss. The next day, a fresh pad of drawing paper and a set of sharpened pencils appeared on Michiko's cot. There was no note. None was needed. Soon, colorful origami cranes, folded from scraps of paper, began to appear, hanging from the wooden rafters like tiny, hopeful prayers. Laughter, once a foreign sound, started to tentatively fill the air during meal times, where chopsticks and forks lay side by side over plates of rice mixed with corned beef. Frank found himself watching them, not as a faceless enemy, but as women. He saw the way Michiko's eyes lit up when she told a story, the weary grace in Hannah's movements. He saw people, and Hannah, sitting amongst them, felt a question taking root in her soul, a terrifying, liberating thought. If they treat prisoners like this, what were we fighting for? The hope was fragile, and it was shattered one morning by the crackle of a loudspeaker, an announcement, first in English, then in Japanese. The voice was distant, metallic, and carried the weight of history. Emperor Hirohito had surrendered. The war was officially over. For the American soldiers, a quiet relief settled over the camp. But for the Japanese nurses, the world simply ended. They fell to their knees on the dusty ground as one, a collective wail of grief rising from their throats. It was not the sound of relief, but of profound shame. Their cause, their God, their entire identity, had been declared a failure. Hannah stared blankly at the dirt, her face a stone mask. "Then, we are nothing now," she whispered to the dust. Frank, seeing her devastation, walked over. He didn't know what to say. He reached a hand out, a clumsy gesture of comfort. Hannah recoiled as if burned. "You will never understand what we lost," she said, her voice raw with a pain he couldn't touch. That night, a thick silence pressed down on the camp. Frank, unable to rest, was outside tinkering with a faulty generator, the methodical work, a balm for his own conflicted feelings. He heard a soft footstep and looked up to see Hannah standing there, a steaming mug in her hands. She offered it to him. Tea. She sat on an overturned crate nearby, and for a long time, they said nothing, the hum of the generator filling the space between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. He told her about his brother at Leyte, and she, in halting, broken English, told him about the caves where she had watched her patients die, their hands clutching hers. They were not an American and a Japanese. They were just two survivors, adrift on the same quiet sea of guilt, each finding in the other's sorrow a strange and solemn reflection of their own. The precarious peace was broken by the arrival of a jeep that kicked up a storm of dust and authority. Colonel Richard Harwood, an inspector from headquarters, had arrived unannounced. He was a man made of straight lines and regulations, and he saw Camp Harmony not as a place of healing, but as a catastrophic failure of discipline. He stormed through the barracks, his eyes narrowing at the origami cranes, the clean blankets, the relative calm. "You're making them comfortable?" He roared at Eleanor, his voice echoing through the compound. "These are the enemy." His orders were swift and brutal. The extra comforts were to be removed, blankets confiscated, warm meals reduced to basic rations. No more music, no more drawings. "Sir," Eleanor said, her voice dangerously quiet, "mercy is not weakness." The colonel sneered. "It is when the public sees it that way." That night, Frank couldn't stand it. He slipped into the supply tent, gathered a stack of the confiscated blankets, and carried them toward the women's barracks. He was caught before he made it halfway. The punishment was public and swift. He was demoted to private and confined to quarters. From behind the thin walls of her barracks, Hannah saw it all. She watched the kind American sergeant, the man who had shared his coffee and his grief, being publicly shamed for an act of simple human decency. The next morning, as he was being escorted to his confinement, he passed by the fence of the women's compound. Hannah was waiting. She stood perfectly still, and as he drew near, she performed the deepest, most formal bow of respect he had ever seen. It was an acknowledgement, a promise, a gesture of profound gratitude that transcended language. Later, in the cold of the night, Hannah wrapped herself in her thin uniform. Shivering, the wool blanket was gone, but she clutched the memory of its warmth, the invisible blanket of kindness that no colonel could ever take away. Weeks later, the day of departure arrived. The once bustling barracks of Camp Harmony stood stark and empty, swept clean of everything but memories. The air, which had briefly held the scent of coffee and the sound of humming, was now just the humid, neutral air of the jungle. Hannah Kondo, looking frail but with a new light in her eyes, walked through the hollow space one last time. The cots were stripped bare, the rafters empty of their paper cranes. She ran a hand along the rough wood of a window frame, the place where she had first seen the impossible sight of folded blankets. Michiko came and stood beside her, her own face a mixture of relief and a sorrow she couldn't quite name. Hannah turned to her, her voice low and steady. "When I first came here," she said, more to herself than to the younger nurse, "I thought mercy was a trick, a weapon I didn't understand." She paused, looking out at the waiting trucks. "Now I see. It was a gift I couldn't repay." From the steps of the main office, Eleanor Reeves and Frank Dwyer watched the women board the trucks. Frank's arm was no longer in a sling from his demotion, but the weight of it remained. The engines rumbled to life, a final, definitive sound that severed the strange connection that had formed in this place. As the convoy pulled away, kicking up a cloud of red dust that hung in the air like a final, fading sigh, Frank shoved his hands in his pockets. "Guess that's the end of it," he murmured, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. Eleanor didn't look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on the road, on the space where the trucks had been. "No," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "Kindness never ends where it's given. It just travels." The years passed. The world changed. 1968. In a quiet hospital in rural Iowa, a gray-haired orderly named Frank Dwyer was mopping the linoleum floors, his movements slow and methodical. The sharp, antiseptic smell of the hospital was the scent of his life now, a life of quiet service far removed from the mud and blood of Luzon. One afternoon, the head administrator called him into her office. There was a letter for him, a thin, airmail envelope covered in unfamiliar stamps and forwarding addresses, a ghost that had wandered through army archives for 2 decades to find him. He sat on a bench in the empty hospital chapel, his hands, now wrinkled and spotted with age, trembling slightly as he opened it. The letter was from Japan. It was from Hana Kondo. She wrote that she was a midwife now, that she spent her days bringing new life into the world, and then she told him about the old barracks of Camp Harmony. After the war, she had helped raise the funds to have them restored, not as a monument to conflict, but as a maternity clinic, a place of birth on a ground that had held so much death. Near the end of the letter, a single paragraph made Frank's breath catch in his throat. "I have used your blanket every winter," she wrote. "It has kept my own children warm. I teach my students here that the greatest strength is not in taking life, but in preserving it. The mercy you showed us taught me that. You taught me it was not a weakness." Frank closed his eyes, and he wasn't in Iowa anymore. He was back in the jungle night, hearing Eleanor's quiet voice confronting a furious colonel. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the neat, careful handwriting. He smiled, a deep, cleansing smile that reached all the broken places inside him. Later that day, he saw a young volunteer, a girl barely out of high school, looking weary after a long shift. He walked over to her, the letter still in his hand. "See this?" he said quietly, holding it out for her. "This came today, from a long time ago." She looked at him, confused. He tapped the thin paper with his finger. "That," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that's what winning really looks like." And across the world, an invisible thread pulled taut. In a small clinic in a Japanese coastal town, Hana Kondo took a newborn from its exhausted, beaming mother. She wrapped the crying infant in a faded, worn US Army blanket, its grey wool softened by years of use, and placed the child safely in its mother's arms. In Iowa, Frank Dwyer went home and carefully folded the letter, placing it inside the worn leather of his family Bible. Tucked beside it was a single, pressed paper crane, its colors faded, a relic of a hope he had almost forgotten he'd kept. The wind blew, whispering through the endless fields of corn, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. And on the other side of the world, that same wind rustled through the branches of cherry trees, just beginning to blossom, as the world, somehow, in its own slow and mysterious way, kept healing. The letter did not change the past. It did not bring back Frank's brother, nor did it erase the years of bitter anger that had coiled in his heart like a sleeping snake. But it rearranged the present. The anger was still there, a faint scar on his soul, but it no longer had venom. It was just a memory, and beside it, now, grew something new and unexpected, a quiet garden of peace. In the halls of the Iowa hospital, Frank Dwyer became a different kind of man. The staff had always known him as dependable, quiet, a bit gruff, but now, a new gentleness infused his work. He learned the names of the patient's children. He lingered an extra moment with the lonely and the scared, his presence a silent offering of comfort. He had seen firsthand how a single, simple act, offering a blanket to someone shivering in the cold, could echo across decades and oceans. He now understood that his work was not about mopping floors or changing bedpans. It was about tending to the small, unseen fractures in the human spirit. He was no longer just a survivor of a war. He was a custodian of its most fragile lesson. Across the Pacific, in the small coastal town where the sea breeze always smelled of salt and pine, Hana Kondo's clinic was a beacon. It was more than a place for birth. It was a place of becoming. The building itself, the restored American barracks, was a testament to transformation. Hana ran it with the same meticulous discipline she had learned in the army, but it was a discipline now in service of life, not of a dying empire. She was a respected elder in her community, her hands having welcomed hundreds of new souls into the world. Her former nurse, Michiko, now a grandmother herself, would visit once a month, bringing her sketchbook. It was no longer filled with the haunted faces of dying boys. Now, its pages bloomed with the laughing, round faces of the babies born within those walls. They would sit together, drinking tea, and sometimes Michiko would pull out the old, tattered sketchbook from the war. They would look at the ghost faces, not with shame or sorrow, but with a quiet reverence. They were the ancestors of this new peace. The price that had been paid for this gentle present, and what of the others? Eleanor Reeves had served out her time in the army, her record spotless, but her quiet acts of compassionate insubordination noted and filed away. She retired to a small town in Pennsylvania, where she volunteered at her church, organizing food drives and tending a community garden. She never spoke of the war, not because she wanted to forget it, but because she was too busy living its lessons. She understood that mercy wasn't a grand, theatrical gesture. It was daily work, like weeding a garden or checking on a neighbor. It was a muscle that grew stronger with use. And Colonel Harwood, the man of iron and regulation, he had risen through the ranks, retiring with a chest full of medals and a thick pension. He lived in a large, empty house, his life ordered and precise. He had won every argument, enforced every rule, and upheld every standard. He had built a fortress of discipline, only to find himself its sole, lonely prisoner. He had fought a war for control and order, never realizing that the most powerful force in the universe was the one he had tried so desperately to stamp out. Years melted into years. One autumn evening, an aging Frank Dwyer stood on his porch in Iowa, watching the sun set over the cornfields, the sky painted in streaks of orange and purple. The air was crisp, and he pulled his sweater tighter, the motion familiar, comforting. In that same moment, on the other side of the planet, the sun was rising over the ocean in Japan. Hana Kondo stood at the window of her clinic, looking out at the morning waves. A new mother was asleep down the hall, her tiny, hours-old son swaddled in a familiar grey wool blanket. Frank and Hana would never see each other again. They would never speak another word. They didn't need to. Their lives had become the ongoing conversation. They were two small lights, ignited by a single spark of improbable kindness in the deep darkness of a war. And their light, passed on through 1,000 small acts of grace, was still traveling, a quiet, stubborn proof that the truest victory is not a matter of defeating an enemy, but of discovering a shared humanity,